Hey everyone, and thanks for joining our explainer. Today, we're going to tackle some really foundational economic ideas and then see how they help us understand a major public policy issue that you hear about all the time. So welcome to our fun little study group for PP5375, that's Economic Analysis for Public Policy and Management. We're diving right into Section 08, which is all about monopoly. We'll be pulling from the Monopoly notes and the PowerPoint, and then we're going to shift gears and use those same tools to analyze the immigration policy PowerPoint. So let's get into it. All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll get a solid handle on what monopoly power actually is and why it has a social cost. Then, we'll take that economic toolkit and apply it to the super complex topic of immigration, specifically that hot-button debate about wages. And finally, we'll pull back and look at the whole shebang. Okay, let's kick things off with monopoly power. We've talked a lot about perfectly competitive markets, with tons of buyers and sellers. But what happens when you go to the absolute other extreme? What happens when there's literally only one seller in town? Well, that's a monopoly, and it really boils down to three key things. One, you've got a single seller. Two, they're selling something with no close substitutes. And three, and this is the big one, there are some serious barriers that make it basically impossible for anyone else to jump in and compete. So what do these barriers look like in the real world? Well, sometimes a single company just owns a critical resource. Think De Beers in the diamond market for decades. Other times, the government steps in and grants exclusive rights, like a patent for a new drug. And then there's something called a natural monopoly, which happens when the startup costs are so insanely high, like building a whole new power grid, that it's just way more efficient to have one company do it. And this leads to the most important difference of all. A firm in a competitive market is a price taker. They just have to accept whatever the market price is. But a monopolist? They're a price setter. Because they are the market, they face the entire downward-sloping demand curve, which gives them the power to choose a price that's higher than their marginal revenue. Okay, so this brings up a really crucial question. For a competitive firm, if you sell one more widget, you get the market price for it. Pretty straightforward. But why is it that for a monopolist, the extra money they get for selling one more unit, their marginal revenue, is actually less than the price they're charging? And here's the aha moment. Think about it. To get that next customer to buy, the monopolist has to drop the price a little. But here's the catch. They can't just drop the price for that one person. They have to lower it for everyone. So while they gain the money from that new sale, they lose a little bit of cash on all the other units they were selling at the higher price. That's the trade-off. And that's exactly why their marginal revenue is always lagging behind their price. So this pricing power is obviously awesome for the monopolist. But what about for the rest of us? Why do economists get so worried about it? Let's dig into what we call the social cost of monopoly. Unlike a competitive firm that gets its profits competed away, a monopolist can keep earning profits year after year. So you might ask, okay, one company gets rich. Is that really so bad for society as a whole? Well, this table tells the whole story. Look at the top row. For perfect competition, consumers get a ton of value. That's consumer surplus, represented by all those areas from A through E. The producer gets their piece of the pie, too, in areas F, G, and H. But now look what happens with a monopoly. The price goes up, consumer surplus absolutely shrinks down to just A and B. The producer, meanwhile, not only keeps their original surplus, but also grabs areas C and D from consumers. But wait a minute, what happened to areas E and H? Poof, they're just gone. Those missing pieces, E and H, are what economists call dead weight loss. And this isn't just money moving from one pocket to another. It's a true net loss for society. It represents all the sales that should have happened, where a buyer was willing to pay more than it cost to produce, but didn't, because the monopoly price was just too high. So here's the bottom line. The harm to consumers is actually greater than the benefit to the monopolist. Okay, so we've got our tools for thinking about market efficiency. Now let's pivot and apply them to something, well, a lot more complicated and definitely a hot topic, the economic impact of immigration. Just for some quick context, it helps to know that the rules for immigration to the U.S. have changed a lot. We've gone from early regulations to outright bans on certain groups, to a strict quota system. The last really massive overhaul was back in 1965, which shifted the focus to family ties. And there hasn't been another major reform since 1990. All that history matters for what we see today. And wow, you can really see the impact of those policy shifts right here. Back in 1910, almost all immigrants to the U.S. came from Europe or Canada. Fast forward to today, and the picture has completely flipped, with more than 80% coming from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia. And this leads us to the big, thorny economic question that always comes up in this conversation. When new people arrive and join the workforce, what does that do to the wages of the people who are already living and working here? Does it help or does it hurt? How you answer that question really boils down to one key economic idea. Do you see immigrant workers as substitutes or complements? If they're substitutes, meaning they have similar skills and are competing for the exact same jobs, then basic supply and demand tells you that a bigger supply of labor could push wages down. But what if they're complements? What if they have different skills and specialize in different things? In that case, they can actually make native-born workers more productive, which could, in turn, raise their wages. So you'd think we could just look at the data and get a straight answer, right? Well, it's not that simple. You have top-tier economists looking at the data and coming to totally different conclusions. On one hand, you have research from Ottaviano and Perry suggesting a small positive wage impact. On the other, you have George Borges finding a negative one. This is a perfect example of how the assumptions you build into your economic model can really drive your results. It often comes down to things like how quickly they assume capital in the economy can adjust to new workers. This is where things get really fascinating. To try and cut through the noise, economists love to find natural experiments. One of the most famous is the Mariel boat lift. In 1980, thousands of Cubans arrived in Miami, and the city's labor force suddenly grew by 7% in just a few months. Nobel laureate David Card studied this and found basically no effect on the wages or unemployment of local workers. It was a finding that really challenged that simple more workers equals lower wages story. So what happens when you step back and look at all the research? When you combine dozens and dozens of studies? Well, multiple meta-analyses have done just that, and they find that the average effect of immigration on the wages of native-born workers is incredibly small. It's essentially zero. Now, there's still debate about the effects on specific smaller groups, but the overall average impact is pretty much negligible. Look, the wage debate is important, and it gets all the headlines, but focusing only on that one question means you're missing a huge part of the economic story. So let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. And when we do zoom out, a whole bunch of other positive impacts come into view. Research points to things like lower prices for consumers on services. High-skilled immigrants are a huge engine for innovation. Immigrants are more likely to start new businesses. Their children show incredible rates of upward mobility. And over a lifetime, immigrants tend to be a net positive for the federal budget, paying more in taxes than they receive in benefits. So what's the big takeaway from our session today? Well, monopoly theory is pretty clean. It gives us a clear, predictable model of inefficiency and deadweight loss. But when we apply our economic tools to a real-world issue like immigration, the story becomes so much more nuanced. The evidence suggests that while the direct wage effects are, on average, very small, the broader benefits to the economy are pretty widespread and significant. And that leaves us with one final, pretty big question to chew on, especially for those of us studying public policy. Our economic models are powerful. They give us a clear framework for thinking about the world. But as we just saw, the real-world data often reveals a much messier, more complex reality. So if you're the policymaker who has to make a decision, which do you weigh more heavily, the clean theory or the complex evidence?